So, good afternoon again. Thank you for staying with us so long. I know it's getting late and this is a very long day. And those who will stay with us will be eventually rewarded by the invitation to the dinner and to the Heuriger and beer and or wine or whatever you should expect. And I've been instructed to tell you that you actually should stay with us because at 7:15, just outside of this building, there will be a bus waiting for us which will bring us into the ultimate paradise. But you will stay with us also because we have a very interesting and coherent panel, one which I've been waiting for. It will bring us back a little bit back in time to the First World War, to the time in which it all began, the story of European refugees. And we've got three young researchers who I think will also, my hope for this panel is that they will not only give us insight into their new and original research, but they will also help us to look differently at the story of First World War refugees in the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, bringing this story beyond the large cities into whatever countryside, hinterland, or however we call it, looking more at refugees and the others in the daily life, or looking at this, for instance, from the gender perspective. And having said this, let me introduce the first speaker, who's Ines KOELTZSCH, who's a researcher at the Masarykův Institute and Archive of the Czech Academy of Science in Prague. Ines is the author of a very well-received study about Czechs, Germans and Jews in interwar Prague, named Geteilte Kulturen, eine Geschichte der tschechisch-jüdisch-deutschen Beziehungen in Prague, a book which was also recently translated into Czech. Ines focuses on the modern history of Jewish and non-Jewish relations, and currently she's working on a project about Jewish history in Bohemian and Moravian countryside and about the regional or trans-regional migration of Jews in this region. Ines, the floor is yours.
Michal, for the introduction, and thank you for staying here. And as Michal already told, this is the paper I present today is a part of a project in which I deal with manifold migration, Jewish migration from the countryside to the cities, and so I'm not a specialist on the First World War, and I'm also not a specialist on the Refugeedom, but it plays for me it's an important part of my project because most of the refugees came into places or into small towns and which had previously before communities that were already in decline because of migration, and the refugees somehow revived for a short time these places. On the first page of the minutes book of the Relief Committee for I also want to thank Francesco for his paper at the beginning, and I hope that you keep it in mind because he had really nice maps, and also he drew the frame, because now I will go up into the countryside and have to look from the bottom, but Francesco really draw very nicely the bigger frame. On the first page of the minutes book of the Relief Committee for Galician Refugees in the central Bohemian industrial town Kladno, their abrupt departure was described in Czech with the following words. On November 1914, we do not know the exact date, the assistant of the Pushtihrad railway at the Kladno station called the president of the Jewish community of Kladno and informed him that in the morning a train with about 1,700 refugees will pass the Kladno station and that they will need refreshments and food. the President Siegfried Löwner, with the assistance of several members of the Jewish community, women and young ladies, tried to get above all bread to the station within a short time. Approximately 30 men and ladies awaited the announced train at the station. The train arrived. It had about 52 wagons. Herded together in each were between 40 and 50 persons of various ages and sex. They were all weakened and hungry. They grabbed the bread from the hands of the waiting women and men. None of those who participated in the service at the station will forget the picture of horror and misery that was offered by the helpless refugees. A quote ends. As the unknown author of the minutes recounted, the scene was repeated nearly day by day in the following weeks, and almost all members of the Jewish community in Kladno worked permanently day and night for the refugee relief. While the first entry you see on the left side probably added retrospectively, and I quoted from this, and the minutes of the first meetings of the relief are penned in a clear handwriting, the entries of the following months are hastily written and often unreadable. You can see on the right hand. These entries document the needs and problems of the refugees in the political district of Kladno, where they were spread in about 35 localities. The situation at Kladno main station as a transit point is representative of many regional centers in Bohemia and Moravia from the autumn of 1914 onwards, where during the entire World War, more than 100,000 Jewish refugees, probably 150,000 refugees, as well as tens of thousands of refugees of other backgrounds, stayed for a shorter or longer period. The East European Jewish refugees, the biggest group of refugees in the Bohemian lands, were not only settled in big cities like Prague, Brno or Pilsen, or in often makeshift refugee camps in Nikolsburg, Mykolov, Gaya, Kiev, and Boritz, Bohoshalice, but were also sent into hundreds of small towns, villages, and settlements. And so I just have a map from the smaller communities before the First World War, but maybe you can remember the map presented by Francesco, where you can see a similar picture of this immense dispersion of the refugee settlements, which goes parallel to the traditional places of Jewish communities in Bohemia and Moravia. Because of this immense dispersion of refugees across the countryside, the organization of refugee relief in Bohemia and Moravia was very convoluted, zerstreut, as the report of the Israelitische Allianz zu Wien pointed out in 1916. Thus, it was difficult to organize. In the first part of my paper, I will present a short outline of the stay of the Galician and Bukovinan Jewish refugees in Bohemia and Moravia and the refugee relief, which were relatively well documented by the regional authorities and local relief committees. These sources reflect the predominant view of the refugees as administrative objects, as already Francesco mentioned, which were accompanied by often negative images of the refugees as uncivilized on the one hand, and also positive perceptions of the refugees as helpless on the other hand. In either case, the refugees were mostly perceived as a homogeneous, a mostly ethnic group, and expressed the sense of overwhelming threat to social order, as Peter Cattrall and others have pointed out, with regard to the pervasive metaphors such as flood, wave, or stream, used in this time as well. Despite the ambivalent attitudes towards the Galician and Bukovinian Jewish refugees, including within the local Jewish communities in the Bohemian lands, the people who served in the relief committees or supported them regarded the aid for refugees as their patriotic duty. In the second part, I will focus on letters written by ordinary Jewish refugees and local representatives on behalf of the refugees to the relief committees during the First World War, which are preserved in the files of various relief committees in Bohemia and Moravia in the archive of the Jewish Museum in Prague. The villages and localities were often too far from the responsible relief committee and or the regional authority in the given center of a political district, and the refugees were therefore not able to visit the committee's regional officials to ask for their needs. This became especially necessary in cases where the given municipality, which was in charge of the state relief, did not care for the refugees despite its obligations. As I will argue, these letters, which have not been taken into account by historians dealing with the Jewish refugees so far, are an important source not only because they show the shortcomings of the seemingly well-organized refugee relief in Cisleithania during the First World War, but because they offer an insight, despite their often limited contents, into the experiences and feelings of the Jewish refugees who speak to them as subjects. Now I come to the first part, refugee relief as a patriotic duty. The Jewish and non-Jewish refugees from Galicia and Bukovina began arriving in Bohemia and Moravia individually or on organized mass train transports already in the first weeks and months after the outbreak of the war. At the so-called balustration stations on the internal borders, they were checked and selected mainly according to ethnic and social criteria and then sent by train, often in cattle wagons, to refugee camps or regional centers, where they again were selected and distributed to numerous small towns and villages. The situation after the arrival of the refugees in a big town and before their subsequent departure to another place was described in the annual report of the Relief Committee in Brünn, and I would like to quote: "The unfortunates, who mostly belonged to the Jewish confession and presented themselves with their indigenous traditional costume, kaftan and ringlets, ringellocken it's in the original source, already with regard to their outlook as a foreign element, sought to stay in the big city because they hoped for ample possibilities to earn a living and because the existing schools enabled the education of their children. During the day, the refugee groups gathered on squares, especially on the square in front of the train station, and the unfortunates aroused the disagreeable interest of the pedestrians." Quote ends. In contrast to the Relief Committee in Kladno, which I cited at the beginning of this paper, this report by the Relief Committee in Brno characterized the refugees not only as helpless people, but also as cultural others, a common perception among local non-Jews and Jews, as for instance Michal FRANKL expounded in his exhibition Orient in Bohemia, Jewish Refugees During First World War, which took place last year in the Jewish Museum in Prague, and Michal wrote a short but very substantial article on this exhibition. The perception of cultural others was even more apparent in the documents of regional and local authorities, who often emphasized that especially the Jewish refugees were dirty and did not behave appropriately to the war situation, thus arousing resentment among the local inhabitants. They were not only accused of hoarding or wasting flour, mainly with regard to matzot for Pesach, but also, as in the case of the Moravian small town Leibnik-Lipnik, of using too many candles for Shabbat on Friday evenings. It was not unusual for regional authorities to threaten the refugees with suspension of financial support if, for example, they did not fulfill the requirements of hygiene or if they moved to another place without permission. The report of the Brno Relief Committee is also interesting because it offers some reasons as to why Jewish refugees did not want to stay in villages and smaller localities. Aside from the problem of earning a living and the education of their children, the towns were mostly preferred because they provided at least a certain social and cultural infrastructure for refugees, as well as a certain protection against physical attack. By contrast, the registered refugees who had to settle in the countryside often lived in social isolation. These often comprised one or two families or parts of a family per village, mostly women with children and elderly people. They did not have the same access to infrastructure as in towns. Furthermore, they were often too weak to walk to the next small town or city and to demand their needs. If they lived in villages with few Jewish inhabitants, they had a so-called Vertrauensmann, a representative who stood in contact with the relief committee in the next district town or next bigger town. These representatives were often also responsible for other villages and remote settlements in the area where other refugees lived. The relief committees and their representatives in the countryside thus functioned partly as a mediator between the local and regional authorities. The committees collected and reported the complaints and needs of the Jewish refugees in the countryside and informed the regional authorities. They thus often exposed the shortcomings of the local authorities who were responsible for providing material support as housing, food, etc., and paying out the financial support of the state. In reaction to these reports, the regional authorities then requested the municipalities live up to their responsibilities and called on the local population of a district to behave well and to sell their products to the refugees at an affordable price. At the same time, the regional authorities demanded that the local relief committees influence the Jewish refugees with regard to hygiene and health. The Bezirkshauptmannschaften or district commissions, as I mentioned, thus played a double role of support and control, often depending on the personalities of each district. The motives of the Jewish members of the relief committees or the members of a given Jewish community for providing aid to the Galician and Bukovinian refugees differed. Certain resentments against the refugees were discernible, for example, with regard to the establishment of the so-called German Jewish schools. It means schools with Yiddish as the language of instruction in prevailing Czech-speaking Jewish communities. However, the local relief committees, with their often exclusively Jewish members, as well as private Jewish charities, did provide an enormous refugee relief. The relief work was also an expression of loyalty towards the empire, as, for instance, the author of the minutes books of the relief committee in Kladno expressed, every patriotic citizen, as I quote, had to care for the refugees with compassion and support. Now I come to the second part and to the letters from and about Jewish refugees. The letters and postcards, mainly complaints and petitions, written by ordinary Jewish refugees or local Jewish inhabitants, paint a slightly different picture from the refugee relief, which was often glorified in the official publications of the state authorities and the relief committees. I examined some dozens of letters and postcards from 3 rural districts, and these are Přeštice, Brestitz, Western Bohemia, many Czech-speaking districts south of Pilsen, Vlašim and its surroundings, which belong to the mainly Czech-speaking central Bohemian district of Benešov, southeast of Prague. And in both, the Jewish inhabitants are bilingual. And finally, from Lipnik and its surroundings, and it's a linguistical mixed small town in central Moravia, east of Olmütz. And here are only one impression of the material I studied, a letter and a postcard. The letters from and about Jewish refugees of the named districts were mainly addressed to the local relief committee, the local Jewish community, or to its president. Their single or collective authors were refugees of various social and cultural backgrounds, and in a few cases, local Jewish inhabitants, mostly representatives of Vertrauensmänner from villages who stood in contact with the relief committee. I here exclude letters written by the relief committee or by officials like notaries on behalf of a refugee to the district commissions, because these letters were written in a professional, bureaucratic style by contrast to the letters examined here, which are characterized by a certain spontaneity and orality. These letters are mostly written in German and a few in Czech from the Přeštice and Vlašim region. Influences of Yiddish in German letters and of Polish in Czech letters are apparent. The letters often contain spelling mistakes and their style differs, which is also an indication of the various social and educational backgrounds of the authors. The authors formulated first of all, very briefly, their basic needs such as food, clothes, shoes, heating materials, proper housing and money for extraordinary costs in connection with illness, medical care or funerals. In a postcard from January 1916, for example, Regina Stern, who stayed with her daughter and another family in the relatively large village of Märklin, wrote to Otto Bloch, the president of the Jewish community and head of the relief committee in Přeštice, asking for the shoes that she had not yet received. Without appropriate shoes, she could not get to Vlašim, as she explained, and now I quote in German because the language is really special and I could not depict it in a translation. Geehrter Herr Bloch, and here you will see the influence of Yiddish and there are a lot of spelling mistakes. Geehrter Herr Bloch, bitte mir zu entschuldigen vielmals, was ich bemühe Sie. Der Gendarm war bei mir nochmals und hat mich gesehen in meine Schuhe gehen. Er hat mir verschrieben ein paar Schuhe und meinem kleinen Mädel auch ein paar Schuhe hat er verschrieben. Und der Frau Eichler hat er verschrieben 2 Hemden und ein Oberrock. Und es ist schon seither einige Wochen. Ich bitte, dass der Herr Bloch soll mir schreiben, ob ich dort verschrieben bin. Da ich jetzt nicht gehen konnte, da habe ich nicht in was zu gehen. Und bitte zu schreiben, wann ich soll zur Maß kommen. Mit voller Achtung, Regina Stern und Frau Eichler aus Märklin. I could not detect the name of Miss Eichler. By contrast to Regina Stern, who obviously had problems writing in German, Deborah Rieger, who lived with her daughter and her attendant as the only refugees in the small village of Rattaje, wrote in a clear German and also in Czech several times to the Jewish community in Vlašim. She mainly asked for support because her son, a soldier, was injured in hospital and needed additional food. In October 1970, she wrote, for example, Herrn B. Kraus, Unterzeichnete erlaubt sich höflichst folgende Bitte vorzulegen. Ich habe einen Sohn als Soldat, welcher im Spital krank ist und verlangt von mir Unterstützung. Wenn ich ihm zeitweise etwas schicke, so bleibt mir gar nichts übrig. So bitte ich daher den Herrn Kultusvorsteher, mir eine Unterstützung zu gewähren. Im Voraus besten Dank, Deborah Rieger, derzeit in Ratay. And in another case, the dressmaker Fanny Bistina, who lived with her mother, sisters and 2 children in the refugee municipality in Držić from Bukovina, asked the relief committee in Leipzig in November 1916 to borrow a sewing machine. I quote, Hochgeehrtes Hilfskomitee, ich bin aus Wischnitz-Bukowina und in meiner Heimat einen Damenmodesalon geführt habe. Und da ich mich jetzt als Flüchtling in Držić mit meiner Mutter, Schwester und 2 Kindern befinde und mit der staatlichen Unterstützung nicht auskommen kann, so stelle ich daher an das geehrte Hilfskomitee die ergebenste Bitte, mir mit einer Nähmaschine für Damenkleider geflissentlich zu verhelfen, damit ich mich meinem Berufe widme und mich auf diese Weise erhalten sowie meine Angehörigen unterstützen kann. Her request was supported by the local board of refugees in Držić as the additional handwriting and the stamp of a Galician rabbi by the name of Josef Hager suggest. It seems, with regard to other handwritings from Držić, that the refugees organized themselves in a refugee committee that regularly worked together with the district relief committee in Leipzig. Most of the postcards and letters are comparable to those of Regina Stern, Deborah Rieger and Fanny Bistina. They do not say much about their personal situation, if at all, but the reader can deduce the hardships of the refugees and their wish to go back to normal life between the lines. So far, I have only found explicit expressions of hardship and feelings of despair in letters written by men. Several male refugees named Maja Glaser, Leib Rosenberg, Chaim Schechter, Abraham Czernowski, Markus Leib-Haller, Josel Dollinger und Abraham Rubin complained in a letter to the Jewish community in Leipzig in November 1916 not only about inappropriate housing and suffering cold, but also about massive physical attacks from the local population. I quote, an den löblichen Kultusrat in Leipzig. Wir Flüchtlinge in Osijek befinden uns in einer sehr schlimmen Lage und trostlosem Zustande und fühlen uns genötigt, uns an die israelitische Kultusgemeinde zu wenden und um Hilfe zu bitten. Wir sind nämlich in einer nicht für Menschen geeigneten, der gesundheitsschädlichen Wohnung im Meierhof untergebracht. Unsere Kinder zittern vor Kälte, obwohl wir den ganzen Tag fortwährend heizen. Bei Nacht schweben wir in Lebensgefahr, von der Straße her werden Steine geschleudert, dass wir uns in Schlupfwinkel verstecken müssen. Die Frauen und Kinder fallen vor Schrecken in Ohnmacht. Wir schreien um Hilfe und niemand erhört unsere Stimme. Was sollen wir nur tun? Wir können nicht mehr aushalten. Sollen wir uns dem Tode hingeben? In der Hoffnung, dass Sie unser Erbarmen werden, zeichnen wir im Voraus dankend. If the refugees from Osijek received help and were resettled elsewhere, I cannot tell from the preserved files of the Relief Committee in Leipzig. The appeal to the Jewish community to do something about the misery is, however, reminiscent of another appeal by Hermann Pleyer from May 1915. Pleyer, an ordinary 59-year-old merchant who probably spent most of his life in the western Bohemian district of Preštice, lived with his wife in the little village Gebel and probably served as a representative, as a Vertrauensmann for the relief committee in Preštice. In 3 letters from May 1915, he described the miserable living conditions of the refugees in the surrounding area and appealed to the president of the Jewish community in Preštice to take action on behalf of the refugees. In the first and most extensive letter, which he opened with a Hebrew and a German quotation from the Book of Lamentations, traditionally ascribed to Jeremiah, and the quotation is, I'm the man who was seen in affliction. Ich bin der Mann, der das Elend gesehen. He wrote, I quote, Wohlgeboren Herrn Otto Bloch, Prestitz. Was nützt den Armen, den Ärmsten unser Verein, da uns keine Mittel, keine Rechte zur Verfügung stehen? Ein nur menschlicheres Dasein diesen Leuten zu verschaffen. Es gibt Tierschutzvereine, aber Menschenschutzvereine kenne ich nicht. Für das liebe Vieh werden Paläste gebaut, Menschen werden in Löcher gejagt, ohne Streu, ohne Futter. Jetzt hören Sie, in Groß-Nettanitz, kleines Zimmer, 11 Personen, keine Britschen, kein Stroh, keine Strohsäcke, keine Decken, keine Lebensmittel. Da ist nur Frau, deren Mann seit der Mobilisierung im Feld steht, hat 7 kleine Kinder, barfuß ohne Wäsche und Kleider, keine staatliche Unterstützung. Da weiß ich mir nicht zu raten, nicht zu helfen. Sie heißt Rachel Bresser aus Stanislau. Und noch das Ärgste, es ist bei dem Haus kein Klosett. Beim Nachbar werden die Leute nicht zugelassen. Da tut schnelle, ausgiebige Hilfe Not. Hochachtungsvoll Hermann Pleyer. Pleyer wrote again to Bloch in the following days and inquired whether any action had been taken. There is no clear evidence in the files that anything changed in the named villages. However, the files of the Relief Committee of Prestice contain some letters from the District Commission which appeal to the mayors of several small municipalities in the Prestice district to finally care for the refugees, to provide appropriate housing, food, toilets, and to pay out the state support. These were probably informed by the Relief Committee thanks to the letters from Plyer about the very bad living conditions in the named localities. And I come now to my conclusion. The voices of the Jewish refugees during the First World War are less preserved than the documents left behind by the central, regional, and local authorities, who mainly viewed the refugees as administrative objects and often as cultural others. However, a closer look into the files of the local relief committees of the Jewish communities in Bohemia and Moravia, and probably into other source documentations beyond Bohemia and Moravia in the future as well, uncover some hidden traces of the refugees. At first glance, these letters, often only small postcards, look quite similar. Their authors briefly address their basic needs such as housing, food, clothes, money, often without any word about their feelings, their despair, fear, or hope. Only a few writings, which I found so far, by male refugees and of this one representative, offer explicit evidence of the misery and the despair of the refugees in the countryside. In my opinion, a more systematic analysis will show that these various types of letters can reconstruct, to a certain degree, the experiences and feelings of the Galician and Bukovinian Jewish refugees. The letters are interesting because of their small or micro-histories of broken families, of women and their children isolated in small localities, often of their manifold languages and their oral characteristics. Besides this, the refugees and their representatives in the countryside not only formulated their needs, worries, and hardships in these letters, but claimed, even if mostly indirectly and in a very limited way, their rights as human beings. These letters of request and complaint thus do not represent just another tessera to the whole picture of refugeedom during the First World War, but construe, despite all their limitations, omissions, and silences, the refugees as acting subjects. In this regard, they deserve at least a similar place in the historiography of the First World War as the letters from the front have already taken up in the past 2 decades. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ines, for giving us an insight that goes beyond these official and well-known narratives about Jewish refugees. And the next paper will bring us beyond Vienna, paper by Kathryn DENSFORD. Kathryn is a PhD candidate at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. She will give us a little bit of insight again into her research for her dissertation, which is called Beyond Vienna, the Provincial Collapse of Austria in the First World War. Kathryn now enjoys what I think we all would envy, is this research here in Vienna and around Vienna, having received a Fulbright grant for Austria. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. As the Russian army advanced into Bukovina and Galicia in early September 1914, local residents, many of them Jews, fled to the monarchy's interior. As the Ministry of the Interior acknowledged in 1915, after the arrival of additional refugees from the south, quote, "This incoming flood to the hinterland created a new social and ethnic problem, on whose solution depended more than the individual fate of the particular refugees. These refugees, who were classified by the state according to national category, comprised a significant wartime challenge for the monarchy, for the state, as well as for the resident population now confronted with the arrival of these fellow Habsburg citizens with whom they did not necessarily have much in common." Historians have written much on the refugee experience of the Eastern European Jews in Vienna and on aid work undertaken on their behalf, which was significant. However, they were not the only population retreating to the hinterland. The refugees, as other in comparison to locals and in regards to the demands they placed on society for basic needs, contributed to the destabilization of homefront society. During the war, the Habsburg state and some of the monarchy's residents aided the refugees as citizens of the monarchy. However, at the end of the war, nascent nation-states saw these refugees as unwanted foreigners who complicated the process of drawing new state borders. Historian Robert Nemes's work examining the response of one Hungarian town to the arrival of Jewish refugees has shown that these events reinforced ideas of who was local and increased social tensions during the war. This paper examines a similar phenomenon in the provinces of Lower Austria and Moravia along the border, taking into consideration the wider refugee crisis beyond the Jewish refugee population, and addresses both state and resident concerns about these refugees. Not only refugees, but also thousands of soldiers, POWs, and other internees passed through and resided in these provinces, and that's something that I am hoping that I can address in my dissertation. But in the process of this, the demarcations between those who were local and those who arrived from elsewhere hardened. After discussing the initial introduction of the refugees to the provinces, this paper traces the ways in which they were to be regarded as Habsburg citizens, the othering of the refugees by the local population, and then the subsequent redefinition of the refugee status as foreigners at the war's end. I argue that while the refugee crisis enforced ideas of who is local and who is an outsider, this not only pitted residents against the refugees, but also local residents against those of neighboring towns and those of other groups who comprised the local. Thus, understanding the refugee crisis is critical to understanding the overall social dynamics of the home front. Furthermore, this wartime experience for refugees, locals, in the state significantly influenced post-war efforts to untangle wartime population shifts and to draw new international borders. So many of the refugees spent the war, or at least part of the war, in Lower Austria and Moravia, and this Ministry of the Interior report provides a detailed breakdown of the refugee crisis as of October 1st, 1915. At that time, Moravia was home to over 57,000 refugees, while Lower Austria, excluding Vienna, and here I'm talking about Lower Austria, always excluding Vienna in this paper, was home to over 49,000. These provinces housed more refugees than anywhere else in the monarchy other than Vienna and Bohemia. In both Lower Austria and Moravia, the numbers of those who were considered to be without means far outnumbered those who were well off. While both provinces housed a large number of refugees, the ethnic breakdown as categorized by the state differed. Lower Austria housed over 22,000 Ruthenians, over 16,000 Italians, and over 4,000 Jews, in addition to thousands of Poles, Slovenes, Germans, Romanians, and others. Moravia was home to over 20,000 Italians, as well as over 18,000 Jews. And then the province was also home to thousands of Poles, Slovenes, Germans, Ruthenians, Romanians, Croats, and others. These figures provide some indication of the diversity that the refugees brought to both of these provinces. The refugees arrived in the provinces as Habsburg citizens, and as such, the state, private organizations, and local residents attempted to provide aid for them. Housing the refugees provided one of the biggest challenges for the state. The large number of refugees necessitated that the state build and run camps, and in doing so, it recognized the importance of providing housing for Austrian citizens. Southern Moravia was home to several camps for Jewish Galician refugees. The first was built near Nikolsburg, historically home to a large Jewish community, in fall of 1914. Camps in Gaia and Porlitz soon followed. Further afield, the camps in Gmünd and Wolfsburg were built in winter 1914 and 1915 for Ruthenian refugees. By October 1915, nearly 37,000 of the over 49,000 refugees in Lower Austria resided in these camps. In contrast, in Moravia, only approximately 7,000 of the refugees resided in the camps, while over 50,000 were scattered throughout the province. The large number of refugees living in private residences in both provinces meant that they came into direct contact with those already living there. The initial influx of refugees quickly overwhelmed the local population, which was unable to provide sufficient assistance and housing for those who arrived. The situation was serious enough that by December 5th of 1914, district officials in Mistelbach wrote to the Lower Austrian provincial authorities in Vienna explaining the local refugee situation. After the evacuation of Krakow, refugees poured into the district on an almost daily basis without advance notice. These refugees from Bukovina and Galicia filled local accommodations supplied by the community that were already occupied by refugees who had already arrived in the previous months. The overcrowding in these accommodations posed a sanitation risk. The policing of the refugees, the report stated, was impossible, and it was determined that public interest is seriously at risk. The local community had hosted the refugees, it said, in patriotic willingness, but they complained, arguing that other districts and communities without refugees should step up and do their part to house them. While the refugees faced the risk of a public health crisis, the spirit of the local population was also at risk. As this report stressed, their patriotism and willingness to help were being pushed to their limit even in the war's opening months. The mounting threats posed to everyday life decreased the local population's sense of responsibility to care for those who are outside the local community. The report also insinuates that others in the monarchy were not doing all that they could to provide aid, and that they, the people of Mistelbach, faced greater hardship than other districts and communities. In this sense, the report places the people of Mistelbach in opposition to others in the monarchy, whether they be refugees or others in the hinterland. In addition to housing, providing for the refugees' basic needs posed a challenge, and the state, as well as local groups and individuals, attempted to meet these needs. The Ministry of the Interior, in cooperation with Vienna's mayor, formed the Central Office for the Aid of War Refugees, which was created specifically for the aid of Galician and Bukovinian refugees, and subsequent committees then were established for the aid of those from the south. While these aid committees carried out work for the state, they also actively sought private donations for the refugees to supplement the state aid. In addition to the refugee communities, the local population, especially in Moravia and in Bohemia, had aided a large number of Jewish refugees, and the local Jewish organization helped to organize independent aid. As Marcia Rosenblatt has demonstrated in her work, the efforts of these local organizations were extensive, and she has argued that the refugee work undertaken on behalf of the Jewish refugees was motivated by humanitarianism, Austrian patriotism, and solidarity with fellow Jews. Both the state and individual organizations understood these refugees to be Austrian citizens, which drove, at least in part, their aid efforts. In Lower Austria, many of the refugees were initially Ruthenians, who were later joined by Istrians, and the Christian socialist Eggenberger Zeitung repeatedly noted the shared Catholic values of these refugees and Lower Austrians. The refugees near Vitus, for example, showed great devotion to Mary, and the newspaper suggested that many should follow their example. Similarly, an article on the Istrian refugees in Eggenberg from August 1915 noted that these people appeared to be religious and devout, demonstrating this through their behavior at religious processions and through their diligent church attendance. These accounts seem to stress the similarities between the refugees and the resident population, even suggesting that the refugees provided a model of Catholic behavior for Lower Austrians to emulate. These examples, stressing Catholic solidarity, show attempts to rally aid efforts on common religious grounds. While at least some locals attempted to provide for the refugees' everyday needs, this task proved nearly impossible to accomplish as waves of refugees continued to move into the provinces during the war. The Brusilov offensive, launched by Russia on June 4, 1916, resulted in additional population displacement. A letter in the Tagesbote from Kremsier remarked that the area had received an additional influx of 285 refugees from Bukovina since mid-July. The letter's unnamed author noted the intolerance of Kremsier's inhabitants towards this population, perhaps indicating the strain that this was placing on the local community. The same individuals these aid appeals targeted faced their own economic and social challenges during the war, aside from the refugee crisis. These examples also highlight how, even in the early years of the war, the refugee crisis shaped ideas of who belonged to the local community and who was outside of it. As the war went on, and daily life in the provinces became more precarious, local attitudes towards the refugees became more hostile, and refugees were increasingly othered. In January 1917, the Eggenberger Zeitung found it necessary to humanize the local refugees. Quote, "There are now housed in many places refugees as there are with us. Who are these refugees? They are people like us who have a heart, that have a stomach like us. Most are loyal, Slovenes, Ruthenians, or Poles, fatherland-loving patriots they are, who not willingly but on orders had to leave their homeland and could bring only the most necessary belongings. They are our fellow believers, Catholics." This article, while stressing the humanity of the refugees, also focused on aspects of loyalty and shared religious identity. The article went on to remind readers of aid efforts that needed to be undertaken on behalf of these refugees. it would seem that it was necessary to reinforce the similarities between the refugees and locals who had apparently forgotten that these people were also loyal Habsburg citizens. Religion as a common denominator between locals and refugees was used yet again as a means to promote aid. Similarly, in 1918, the Znaimer Tagblatt, while relating the daily expenses of the state in caring for the war refugees, noted that in times of peace, these refugees were tax-paying fellow citizens. These reminders of shared citizenship, however, did not outweigh the physical realities of the home front, where many permanent residents and refugees alike faced desperate circumstances. The housing of refugees in private residences requisitioned by the state provided a source of great frustration for many local residents. In September of 1917, Eggenburg was home to 138 Ruthenian refugees, of whom 74 were living at house number 173. The lack of available accommodations in Eggenburg meant that there were no other places to house them. On August 7th, the house reported its first case of typhus, and a second case was reported on August 15th. A third case involving a 9-year-old girl was reported on September 2nd. In light of the sanitation situation, and given that a doctor from the Lower Austrian provincial government had already carried out an inspection of the area in July and declared that the refugees should be moved, local officials in Eggenburg requested that the refugees be relocated. These refugees lived in cramped, unsanitary conditions, but the sheer number of those seeking refuge in the hinterland overwhelmed the towns in which they were temporarily resided. Those living in these towns, in turn, saw these people as carriers of disease that needed to be removed from their midst. The tension between the refugees and the locals also manifested itself in anti-Semitic charges of ritual murder in 1918 in the Moravian town of Praha. Anti-Semitic violence had increased in the decades before the war, particularly in Moravia in 1899, following the repeal of the Botany Ordinances. A report from the district captain in Praha to the provincial government in Brünn detailed a series of local events that included alleged ritual murder, Czech-German conflict, and frustration with Jewish refugees. Reports had surfaced in Kojetín on March 12th of the alleged ritual murder of the maid Julie Gugler, who had been found next to a sugar factory with her veins sliced open. Though rumors circulating in the community suggested that this was an incident of ritual murder, this was not the case, and the district court in Kojetín had pressed charges against 2 men. The report went on to describe the harassment of the German school teacher and 10 German students by 20 Czech children while on a walk. Furthermore, 2 windows had been stolen from the German school, and someone had broken windows belonging to Rabbi Friedenthal as well as to Ignaz Kaufmann. The report noted that both the Czechs and the existing Jewish population of Kojetín very much disliked the refugees, who were known to buy large quantities of food and then trade it for profit. The report's author attributes the rumors of ritual murder to the discontent that the local population felt in regards to the refugee population's behavior. This report connects several anti-Semitic episodes to social Czech-German conflict while blaming the refugee crisis for these recent incidents. The first section of the report closely mirrors a ritual murder case in Kojetín in 1892 that historian Hillel Kival has analyzed. He's argued that the discourse of ritual murder served an important political function in defining political groups in Bohemian lands in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The connection between the German and Czech conflict made in this 1918 report and its association with the ritual murder is not unique either, as Kival has argued that the discursive practices associated with ritual murder went along with the Czech and German conflict, as Jews could not be seen as fitting squarely into either camp. What is important to note in this case, however, is the implied link between these events and the refugee population, as it places the blame for these events squarely on this segment of the population. This report also conveys a sense of othering within the Jewish community, differentiating between the Jews already living in Moravia and the refugee population. The relation of all these events back to the refugee population may indicate the perception of officials that the refugee crisis further increased other social fissures at various levels in local society. Taken together, these incidents of outright expressions of anti-Semitism and frustrations with refugees as destructive and vectors of disease show how, as the war went on and conditions at home deteriorated, the tensions on the home front increased and distinctions between those who were local and those who were outsiders became more ingrained. In their encounters with the Jewish refugees, locals fell back on previous tropes that furthered the distinctions of who was part of the local community and who was not. The years 1918 to 1919 marked a period of transition along the lower Austrian-Moravian border as the Habsburg monarchy came to an end and the successor states of the First Czechoslovak Republic and German Austria came into existence. The provincial border became a contested and reconfigured international border. As Michael Maris has written in his study of Europe's refugees in the 20th century, in practically every way we can imagine, the First World War imposed on contemporaries the awesome power of the nation-state. The power of the nation-state was applied to the refugees, who were neither German nor Czechoslovak. They were outsiders who posed a threat to the integrity of these new nation-states. While many refugees had returned to their pre-war homes, as the state had attempted to repatriate refugees throughout the war, many Jewish refugees remained. The post-war nation-state building process was particularly hostile to Jewish refugees who faced calls for them to return home. Yet for many, the war was ongoing in their places of origin as the Polish-Ukrainian War made the prospect of returning home dangerous and life-threatening. In light of these circumstances of new states, new borders, ongoing war, the refugees in Lower Austria and Moravia were further othered in the state-building process. These refugees were regarded as, quote, strangers among other former Austrian citizens, as Vienna's Orthodox Weekly, the Jüdische Korrespondenz, reported on November 28, 1918. They were no longer the concern of the new states in which they were residing. The article further explained that Czechoslovakia, which had allegedly been established on principles of justice with the help of the West, did not provide a welcoming environment for these refugees. The article noted the argument of Prime Minister Karel Kamarz that the housing shortage necessitated the return of the refugees to their pre-war homes now located across international borders. The housing shortage, as well as food shortages, were given as reasons to deny entry to the refugees trying to get into German Austria. As the Interior Ministry noted in correspondence with the provincial government in Vienna in November 1918, there was fear that because of the anti-Semitism prevalent in the, quote, Slavic areas, and because Hungary was cutting off funding to these refugees, that a large influx from Bohemia, Moravia, and Hungary would try to get to German Austria, and they were to be denied entry at the border. The refugee issue served as a point of contention between German Austria and Czechoslovakia, and in December, German Austria's Ministry of the Interior expressed additional concerns about the refugees, as there had been several reported instances in which the Czechoslovak government had deported refugees to German Austria. In order to prevent Czechoslovakia from sending their unwanted refugees across the border, it was necessary for the police to establish stations to monitor transit. Only those who were passing through in order to be repatriated to another state would be granted passage. It was believed that monitoring transit would be easy to accomplish, since the Jewish refugees would be easily identifiable. While there had been many refugees during the war in addition to Jews, the post-war refugee crisis was distinctly a Jewish problem. The refugee crisis and the formation of the borders went hand in hand. State management of refugees helped to reinforce these new international borders in order to keep outsiders out. The desires of the state to limit and determine the composition of its population far outweighed those of refugees, some of whom wanted to stay in the places that had become home to them in the course of the war. Leo Kraus, born in 1888 in Galicia, wrote to the police directorate in Brünn, now at this time Brno, on September 9, 1919, stating, "By the expulsion action of the Ministry of the Interior, I would be completely destroyed in my existence." He went on to make his case for staying in Czechoslovakia. He had arrived in Brno in 1918 after demobilization, and he was employed as a language teacher. He had no father, and he was the sole supporter of his mother and his sister, and he contested that it would be impossible to find work in Galicia. He acknowledged concerns about the housing shortage, which had been used as a justification to send many refugees back to their pre-war homes, and stated that he was living, quote, in only a small closet. Therefore, he hoped that he would be allowed to stay in Brno. Brno's Jewish Social Democratic Labor Party submitted a letter on his behalf on September 21st, stating that he was in fact a language teacher and director of the teaching courses. The Interior Ministry granted his request to stay in late September, along with those of several others, but not all of those who had requested permission to stay were allowed to do so. While in some ways perhaps not a typical Galician refugee, as he had only arrived in Brno in 1918, this case highlights what was at stake for many of these refugees who had nothing to return to elsewhere. His educational background and current employment in the community likely aided his application to stay. Kraus's letter also reflects a keen awareness of the process of being granted permission to stay. His appeal provides multiple reasons for his displacement and subsequent desire to stay in Brno, as he had been displaced by the war, but also claimed that he should be allowed to stay on economic grounds. That Kraus was allowed to stay showed that some refugees took part in the state-building process as well, applying to stay, albeit not always with the outcome that they desired. By the end of 1918 into early 1919, it was clear that the stakes for these refugees had changed. They were no longer within the borders of the Habsburg monarchy. They were outsiders, foreigners who needed to be removed from Lower Austria and Moravia swiftly in line with the establishment of the new nation-states. Without the Habsburg monarchy making these refugees and the local population all citizens of the same state, the only things connecting them were humanitarianism and shared religion. Yet this was not enough to guarantee the refugees a place in the new Czechoslovak and German Austrian states. The desire to provide aid or to tolerate the presence of these outsiders, these refugees, broke down in the course of the war with increasing social pressures. While ideas of who was part of the local community and who was outside of it intensified during the war, post-war political developments allowed for the repatriation or expulsion of many refugees, removing these unwanted outsiders. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathryn, for a very interesting paper. I think adding to what Ines was already talking about and showing how this provincial perspective can be interesting and enriching, especially if we have a border running through this region by the end of 1918. We will now move to the next speaker and our last speaker today, last but not least, who is Jernej KOSI from the University of Ljubljani. Jernej wrote his dissertation about the Slovene national movement in the first half of the 19th century. And he's now researching, including a research in Vienna, the fate of female Slovene refugees during the First World War. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So I will continue where my colleagues and Francesco have stopped and present one case study on how things actually happened in the littoral after the war between Italy and Austria-Hungary broke out in 1915. And I think it is necessary to begin with an obvious question. Describing someone as a refugee can evoke a range of perceptions and ideas. So let me begin this presentation with an obvious question. Whom should we consider a refugee? Which criteria should be fulfilled for a person to be recognized as a refugee? There is no straightforward answer to these questions. If we, for instance, think of recent mass movements of civilian population from conflict zones to the states of the European Union, it is possible to conclude that the answer depends on factors such as political and power relations and interests, media representations, and the responses of individual state administrations, to name only a few. Even internationally agreed upon or national codifications of refugee status should not be taken as the objective basis for further analysis. As we have seen in the recent months in several European countries, these codifications may be changed under the burden of circumstances. So whom do I consider as a refugee in the period between 1915 and 1925? I believe that we cannot simply follow legal definition and ascribe this label only to him or her who was in the time of displacement officially acknowledged as a refugee. Such a narrowing would exclude all people who had been forced from their homes but hadn't or couldn't receive refugee status. In this period, this was the case especially during chaotic immediate post-war years that saw the formation of Kingdom of Serbs, Croats and Slovenes in 1918. At the same time, the question of definition can be answered if we look at the subject from perspective of civilians or citizens. For someone who has had to flee or who has been forcibly evacuated, things are pretty clear. From this perspective, a refugee is anyone who had to leave home involuntarily to escape political persecution, war, violence, or the breakdown of the political and social order. And this is the description, I believe, that from the historiographical point of view is good enough to use it. If I continue. Resettlement of civilians from Austrian Littoral began in May 1915, when it became clear that Italy was going to declare war on Austria-Hungary. The residents of the region who had received reliable information about the impending war began moving even before the Italian declaration of war on 23rd May. The earliest ones were, as one would expect, the families and other relatives of state officials. The majority of the civilians, however, departed after a stable zone of engagement along the Isonzo River had been established in the region of Gorizia and Gradiška north of Trieste. The Isonzo front shattered everyday life of the local multilingual and multinational civilian population. During the summer of 1915, villages, towns, and regions on both sides of the front found themselves in a war zone. Many residents had no option but to move to the hinterland. Some of them left as part of organized evacuation that had been meticulously planned but really poorly executed by Austrian Interior Ministry. Others simply fled for their lives, sometimes under heavy artillery fire. It is also worth mentioning that after the declaration of war, a not so small group of Slovene civilians from the littoral refused to leave. Approximately 12,000 of them were captured by the Italian army and transported into the Italian hinterland. They spent the rest of the war scattered all over Italy. However, majority of civilians moved to the Austrian hinterland. So where did those refugees who had retreated to the areas behind the Austrian lines actually go? In the months preceding the war, Austria's Interior Ministry had prepared an emergency evacuation plan for the civilian population. This plan assumed that civilians would be transported by trains from the war zone. However, the fog of war and especially the lack of trains precluded the execution of this plan. It is thus not surprising that, according to the sources, the majority of the Slovene-speaking inhabitants had to quickly pack their belongings and flee on foot or in carts to Carniola, the nearest Austrian crownland and one that was mainly populated by other Slovene speakers. But because Carniola has been incorporated into the war zone, so Kriegsgebiet, a special administrative region under direct military command, not all of the refugees could stay here. After much deliberation, the Austrian army finally decided that staying within the war zone would be allowed only to civilians who had the financial means to support themselves and their families without state assistance. Civilians from the littoral who didn't have sufficient funds or couldn't find employment were ordered by the provincial government to take the train through examination station Perlustrierungsstation in Wagna near Graz in Styria. From there, they were transported to the provinces of hinterland. This was an official definition of these parts that were not under direct military command during the war regarding the civilian life. Slovene-speaking refugees from the Austrian littoral took shelter in the cities, towns, villages, and refugee camps that were scattered across the Cisleitania. They remained there for more than 2 years and began to return to the littoral only after a heavy defeat and subsequent retreat of Italian army from the Isonzo in the autumn of 1917. Their return proceeded in several steps and was far from smooth. Many of them had no home to return to. Their villages and towns were flattened and their fields ruined by shell craters. The infrastructure in the county of Gorica Gradiška had been either devastated or converted to military use. It is thus not surprising that several thousand refugees were still in Carniola or in internment camps in the hinterland when the ceasefire between Italy and Austria-Hungary was signed in November 1918. After the dissolution of Austria-Hungary and as a consequence of the Treaty of London from 1915 and the Treaty of Saint-Germain in 1919, the entire Austrian Littoral was incorporated into the Kingdom of Italy and became a part of the Venezia Giulia new region as a part of Kingdom of Italy. With such a territorial transformation, the Slovene-speaking inhabitants of this area found themselves living under nationalistic repression and persecution with the tacit support of the Italian government and bureaucracy, in an unhappy contrast to the politically extremely complex, but nevertheless tolerable multilingual and multinational atmosphere of the late Habsburg era. This situation became unbearable for many Slovenes, and especially after Benito Mussolini came to power in 1922 and introduced his fascist politics of national exclusivism. Several thousand Slovenes either voluntarily emigrated or were forced to flee to the nearest Slovene region, which had become a part of the new Kingdom of Yugoslavia. So, what was the attitude of the governments and state bureaucracies towards refugees during and after the war? As it was mentioned before, during World War I, the Austrian government introduced a legislative framework which it expected to contribute to the smooth and successful management of civilians who had been evacuated or had been driven from their homes. Civilians from the littoral who wanted to receive refugee status and the state support that came with it were initially classified by nationality on the one hand and social origin and means of support on the other. The Interior Ministry decided to lodge refugees in the hinterland in separate national groups. Such a separation would perpetuate the prior social relations that refugees had established in their places of origins. At the same time, it would simplify potential communication problems between refugees and the state administration. However, refugees of the same nationality were then subdivided between those who had means to support themselves, bemitteld, and those who didn't, mittellos or unbemitteld. Hence, a two-tier system of state support for the refugees in the hinterland was established. The members of the latter group were sent to refugee camps where the state would provide for them. It is also worth mentioning that the government managed to control and monitor the very people that it suspected were the greatest potential threat to the social order. Consequently, the Slovene population was transported to camps in Gmünd, Steinklam, and Brugg an der Leitha. In contrast, refugees who were fortunate enough to have some money to prove that they had a stable source of income, or who had impressed the officials at the examination station in Vagna as members of higher social stratum, received financial support and were allowed to live outside the refugee camps. They settled in communities that the provincial governments had chosen in advance. Most of the Slovene-speaking refugees fell into this group, and they found temporary homes on farms, in apartments, houses, and reconstructed buildings all over the hinterland. It seems that during the war, nationality and social or class origin defined not only places of refuge, but also the destinies of displaced people who had received refugee status. It is possible to conclude that, from the sources, that refugees who hadn't been transported into refugee camps had better conditions during their years of expulsion. Even though food shortages were chronic all over the hinterland, at least people were not confined behind the fence and were able to make a living for themselves and their families. In contrast, everything was much harder for people who were perceived or who actually were mittellos. The food in the refugee camps was poor and in short supply, and the refugees were constantly on the brink of starvation. In the last months of the war, children and the infirm began to die of malnutrition. The collapse of Austria-Hungary resulted in a new flood of refugees from the littoral. As I have mentioned, After the war, the Italian army occupied this region, which was later incorporated into the easternmost Italian region, Venetia Giulia. The new political order at this territory encouraged the involuntary immigration of Slovenes into the newly established Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. Unfortunately, it is impossible to know for certain how many people actually emigrated. In the first period immediately after the war, the Kingdom of South Slavs or of Yugoslavia, or in the first phase, Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, accepted civilians according to the national principle and without discrimination. All Slovenes and Croats who came from the territories regarded as occupied by the Italian army were thus welcomed by the state regardless. The government didn't settle them in special internment camps or obligatory places of residence. They were allowed to look for jobs and provide for their families as they wished. Many of these refugees contributed to the establishment of the new nationalized state apparatus or took part in official and semi-official national agendas of the newly proclaimed Yugoslav state. Such was the case of former Austrian officials who took over positions in southern Styria that had been left vacant when their German predecessors had been fired or had resigned following the incorporation of this region into the Yugoslavia. Many new Slovene-speaking officials and especially policemen came from the littoral. As one could imagine, these newcomers were not always greeted with open arms. Similar nationalization of administration also took place in the region of Prekmurje, east of Styria. Until 1918, Prekmurje was part of Kingdom of Hungary. In 1990, it was captured by Yugoslav army, and a year later, it was incorporated into the Kingdom of Yugoslavia under the terms of the Treaty of Trianon. During this chaotic period, Hungarian officials in Prekmurje were immediately fired. The new state filled the vacant positions with educated Slovenes from the littoral. And as a consequence, many Slovene teachers, tax collectors, policemen, judges, and other state officials were sent into this underdeveloped region, known at the time as Slovene Siberia. And now, how are refugees treated by the Slovene-speaking communities? This is the question that perplexes me at the moment. Between 1915 and 1925, the Slovene-speaking residents of the littoral took refuge in two states, besides Italy. First in Austria-Hungary and later the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. However, most of them also fled to the territory that 19th century Slovene political and cultural elite had referred to as the Slovene homeland. This imagined territory, named Slovenia by Slovene ethno-linguist nationalists, stretched through many Austrian kronlets and didn't correspond to any political and administrative borders. So the question that I find extremely interesting is how were these Slovene-speaking refugees treated upon their arrival in their supposed homeland? Were they welcomed by the established Slovene communities and their Slovene-speaking compatriots? EU documents from this period, written by refugees, describe the range of experiences. Some benevolent members of the community were kind to the refugees. They hired the adults to work on farms and fields and saw that the children attended school. It is thus no surprise that in their later years, many former refugees still had fond memories of the generosity and friendliness of the local residents. However, there is a large number of reports in which we can read about harassment, intolerance, and hatred. Slovene-speaking refugees were often derided as Lahs, a kind of wops, a pejorative Slovene term for Italians. An elderly man named August Tekar, who as a child had fled with his family to a village near Ljubljani in Carniola, bitterly remembered locals shouting insults at him. I quote, "Damn Lahs, you're eating our bread," end of quote. Clement Juk from Gorica, who had to spend several years as a refugee in Ljubljana during World War I, recalled, and it is worth to mention that a distance between Gorica and Ljubljana is approximately 100 kilometers. I quote, "I came here into the 5th school from Gorica to Ljubljana since our secondary school had been closed due to the war with Italy. Every evening, I watched the sunset and asked the evening light to greet my homeland. The dear locals, who were still the only to give me so much love. At the sight of the bloody light, often tears came to my eyes. The heart wanted love, but it was surrounded by foreigners. On that day, my Greek professor M told me that Goricians are only for causing damage. If only they had stayed at home instead of fearing grenades and coming to Ljubljana to eat other people's bread. These words remained so impressed in my memory that I couldn't forget them even if I had gone through a rumbling fire of 800 times. I liked the work and I was the only one of the classmates that often studied, even after midnight. However, with all my work, I could never satisfy Professor M. He reprimanded me because I was Gorician, and he posed lazier students as good examples. The landlady also criticized me, saying I prayed too little. I also realized that the war was a punishment for the Gorishka region for its ugly sins." End of quote. It is possible to claim that Yuke's memories are a compelling example of the obstacles that awaited Slovene-speaking refugees within the borders of imagined Slovene homeland. Even though the refugees spoke Slovene, it was easy to expose specific cultural traits that were familiar to them, but not to their hosts. For instance, because refugees used some Italian words in their Slovene dialect, they were looked down upon as wops or lachs. They were also very often seen as too forward or liberal, and their friendliness was often viewed with suspicion in the more reserved culture of Carniola. The Slovene-speaking locals used special cultural differentiation to distinguish themselves from the refugees. Different appearances, habits, and behaviors of refugees were sometimes used as to justify suspicion and hatred. Even more, perceived specific cultural traits of refugees were easily appropriated as a pretext to discriminate against them. Testimony of Ljudmila Bizjak, who emigrated as a child with her family from the Littoral to Maribor in Styria, is informative in that regard. I quote, "In Maribor, it was very difficult for us from the Littoral because we were insulted with verdammten Čicen, damn Čich. Čich was an insult in the Littoral. Those people were terribly hostile. I repeat, being a Littoral refugee in Maribor in the interwar period was extremely hard. This is why I do not like Styrians. I know how often my mother was upset and said, 'Those stupid Styrians. They do not even know what is chicory or kale or this or that. And then they call us chich, but they do not even know what artichokes are. They don't have a clue and they call us chichs.'" End of quote. According to sources, it is abundantly clear that the locals blamed the refugees for many social problems that occurred during the precarious years of war and the rocky transition after the breakup of Austria-Hungary. The exhausted and often starving population saw the refugees as a drain on their already limited resources. Besides that, refugees were seen as a threat to the social fabric. Such thinking was not completely unreasonable. Among the Slovene refugees who fled from the Venezia Giulia after 1918 were many school teachers, civil servants, doctors, lawyers, professionally educated and trained people. After crossing the border, they were perceived as people who would take good jobs away from the domestic Slovene-speaking civil servants and intelligentsia. It is therefore not surprising that severe social conditions in Slovene-speaking communities made it possible to politicize the cultural peculiarities ascribed to Slovene refugees. And peculiarities that would on other occasions be easily ignored or dismissed as unimportant suddenly mattered. Thank you.
Thank you, Jernej, for bringing us to the other side of the monarchy in reaching this perspective. Thank you to all of you for your discipline in terms of time. I think, including Francesco's paper before, we have actually created a pretty broad comparative perspective on refugees, refugeedom in the Habsburg monarchy in the First World War. To me, all these papers showed that there's still much to research and that there is considerable potential for further comparative research. And I especially appreciated that these papers in different ways went beyond the typical narratives of refugees framed by nationalist perspectives, narratives of loyalty or narratives of identity. So the floor is open for questions. Bella.
Two questions. One goes to Ines. I would like you to kind of elaborate a little bit, because it wasn't quite clear to me what is the essence of the difference of the Jewish experience in the provinces against the Jewish experience in the cities. And you say kind of in your abstract, you say that it was the reformulation of Jewish identity after the First World War. Is it now, this kind of what you research, is this a kind of an obstacle to this reformulation? Is it something different? What makes it worthwhile to kind of research on these papers, which is a very limited database as far as I understood? And the second question goes to Kathryn, which was a very convincing paper, I think. I think it was a little bit exaggerated to kind of the influence of the refugee question on the elaboration of this identity along the border. But the main question goes that you used certain notions like Habsburg citizens of the monarchy, local outsiders, Austrian citizens. And my question would be, wouldn't it make sense to make it a little bit sharper, all these notions? That I think the essence of your paper is that these notions, the notion of the citizenship, which can be used in a very different way, as you showed with this religious identity in 1917, which is completely different than it becomes later. And when you kind of use these expressions to make it clear that the use of these expressions becomes sharper, and this is the essence what you are saying, I would say, and this is what I would suggest, but maybe you see it differently, and that's my question. That do I see it correctly that these notions of citizenship are changing from 14 to 1918 radically?
Yeah, thank you, Bela, for the question. And with regard to the differences, and I tried to, or I mentioned it in the paper, but maybe it was not strong enough, that of course the problems are the same in the cities as in the countryside. It's the bad housings and so on. The differences is especially in Bohemia and the countryside, but also in parts of Moravia. If you're in the countryside, you are alone. You're like 2, 3, 4, or 6 refugees in a certain locality, and without a refugee relief committee close to it, just to interact immediately at the place. So that the ways are longer to come to get to the committees, for instance, or also to have infrastructure. In some of the, if you live as one Jewish family in a village, you have long ways to get to another village, maybe with a Jewish community, or to a small town with a Jewish community. So they have longer, and quite often they were not able to go on the way to another town and to ask personally, or to request for help. That's also why we have these letters and postcards, because this was the only way how to get into contact. Well, not the only, but the way to contact these committees. And if the refugee group is not so big, or if you're only a part of a family, also then it took a longer time if they were attacked, for instance, that the committee was informed and sent help. And it happened, for instance, to the Deborah Riga I quoted, that she was attacked with her family, and quite often, and it took a certain time, and then she was resettled to another place, to another village where there was a small Jewish community. So this is the difference. If you are in a town, then you can organize yourself much better. I'm sorry. The abstract I wrote before, several months ago, and it also I gave then another paper at another conference, and so I just decided to leave out the loyalty or identity discussion, and it also because the letters goes in another way, or the content of these letters and postcards do not allow as much to discuss the loyalty or identity question. It's just if you deal with the resources of the local Jewish population, then you can discuss it, because how the Czech Jewish or Bohemian Jewish or Moravian Jewish locals perceived the refugees, and how did it influence their understanding of being Jewish, or who was defined as a or if the East European Jews can be stay there or not, and quite often they also saw them as a threat to their successful integration at this point, and they were afraid of another disintegration of the local Jews in course of the East European Jewish refugees. So we also have this discussion within Bohemian Jewry. But on the other hand, of course, you also have other perceptions, Jewish perceptions of in Bohemia, Moravia, mostly attached to the Zionists, but not only, who romanticized the existence or the departure of the refugees as a starting point to a renaissance of Jewish culture in Bohemia and Moravia. But this is just maybe minor discussion, but it's also very prominent.
Thank you very much for your comments. I sort of wrestled with, do I call them Habsburg citizens, fellows, how do I want to refer to them when I was writing this paper? And yes, you're absolutely correct. I'm still wrestling with I haven't come up with this sort of like nice definition of this is when things change, and I still see it as sort of very messy, but that's definitely something for me to keep in mind moving forward with the project. Thank you.
Thank you for your papers. I would like to add something to trying to answer to Belarusky question to Kathryn, and then I would like to ask to Ines and Kathryn something about their research. About the issue of citizenship and identity in the Habsburg Empire, since I would say 10 years, there is a literature dealing with identity feelings and loyalty feelings of common people in the Habsburg Empire. And it comes to my mind books of Peter Judson, Guardians of the Nation, who started this kind of research. And in reality, it's really difficult to explain what was an Austrian citizenship in the mind of common people, because those authors spoke in many cases of national indifference, of national flexible nationalities, or, for example, Lawrence Cole speaks about different special framework of reference about these people. Nevertheless, it's possible, following these authors, to find a switch in the perception of those population during the war, and they, generally speaking, share a general idea of the Austrian citizenship before the war, and they feel more or less as Austrian citizens before the war, but this experience changed narrowly this identity and this loyal towards the Habsburg, and it could be spotted through the analysis of diaries and memories more than through the analysis of official sources. And I could bring, if you want, later some example regarding the Italian-speaking population of the empire. Coming to the question, I would like to know from Ines and Kathryn something more about their researches. For example, in France and in Italy, the refugee crisis became part of the war narratives, and it was used by the state to mobilize the public opinion, and the refugees were sometimes presented as a positive figure because they embodied the violence of the enemy. I had the impression that in the Austrian case that they are simply represented as passive figures or negative figures, and this element undermines the capacity of the local population to help the refugees who came in the hinterland. I was just wondering if from your research you also have this impression, or maybe you can add something in this direction. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your interesting and also difficult question. Yeah, maybe you are right that the potential was much lower than in other parts, or outside the Habsburg monarchy. Sometimes it seems to me that it also depends on the personalities, for instance, of the Bezirkshauptmann, that you can find also differences between the several districts, and so I also found like one district that you really tried to use it as a mobilization for the local population, but it's for me it's just an exception, and it is of course within the Jewish community it does work that they try to mobilize the members or their fellows to get engaged and to say, yeah, it's our patriotic duty and we have to take care. Also, we do not share their religious practices or the understanding of Jewish tradition and so on, and we are quite cultural different. So for the Jewish community, it does work, this appeal.
I think there are certainly for the Jewish community, absolutely, and I mean you can read all these like newspaper articles, attempts to try and mobilize people for some of these various efforts to try and raise funds, and I think that sort of fizzles out rather quickly, any sort of effort to do that.
I also have two questions, one for Kathryn and one for Jernej. You mentioned the statistics, and you mentioned the Ruthenians, and I'm wondering whether all those Ruthenians are refugees or whether they are intermingled with deportees, because in Galicia the Austrian army deported thousands of suspected civilians and deported them to the hinterland, most famously, of course, near Graz, in Thalerhof. I don't know whether in your region were also detention camps for Ruthenians, but what I would be interested whether they were calculated within the statistics of refugees, and whether the local population reacted differently to deportees than to refugees. And for Jernej, I wanted to ask, you said that Carniola was part of the Kriegsgebiet, but there are other Slovenian regions in Habsburg Austria, like southern Styria and southern Carinthia. Why didn't, I mean, it would be in a way obvious from the authorities to send people there, to have them more easily integrated. But I could, of course, imagine that the local authorities in Carinthia did not want to have more Slovenians in southern Carinthia. So this is from the official side. So why did they go send them to Wagner and did not have something in Maribor or in Tilovec. And when you talked about personal experiences, you were only talking of people, private refugees in Caniola. Did some people went to Maribor and I don't know, Železná Kapla and had different experiences there, or were they all the same?
Thank you for your questions. As for the number of Ruthenian refugees that I gave, that was a report strictly on refugees, so I don't know, and I would have to go back and look, but I would think that that would be just talking about refugees, because there are, these reports that state, there are refugees, there are the POWs, there are other internees. So I think, in some sense, I feel like the state tried to categorize, have these different categories, yet they were also very, very messy when you start reading through documents. I've read through files where at one place they're referring to people as POWs, then the next they're referring to them as internees, so it was very messy. But I have a feeling that this was probably refugees, but I would have to go back and look. And as for your second question, that's a great question. I'm not quite sure yet. I've done very little research thus far on the deportees. But my guess, again, is that these categories were somewhat mixed. They could be confused very easily, whether someone was deported or a refugee or a POW or that type of thing, and that the response is in many ways similar. And the few reports that I have read, sometimes the attitudes that are expressed towards POWs or internees are things that you could read in a report about refugees. But something to keep in mind. Thank you.
Thank you for two very interesting questions. Regarding the official side, the general idea of Interior Ministry and Army High Command was to simply transport all civilians from the Kriegsgebiet or Bereich der Armeenvelden. And when Carniola and a part of Styria were incorporated after the opening of Islands Front into this Kriegsgebiet, they tried to do, but from the logistical perspective, they realized that it would be simpler if some of them were allowed to stay within it. Regarding different experience, of course, many of them, many of refugees also stayed in southern Styria, in Železná Kapla and Maribor and so on. And it is also true that many experiences were positive. I mean, according to these EGO documents, correspondence, memoirs, we can see that obviously. However, the thing that really fascinated me was that nevertheless we know a lot about, even that due to the fact that we really know a lot about national indifference and so on, we have to take into consideration also the fact that after 40 years of serious dissemination of Slovene national idea through school, through church, through newspapers, suddenly, out of a sudden, they were regarded, Slovene-speaking civilians were regarded within Slovene communities suddenly as foreign. And this is...
I would like to thank the presenters, and I would like to ask Jernej what happened to them after 1925, because we know that in 1929 the King Alexander I proclaimed the dictatorship, and the Yugoslavism was imposed to the inhabitants of the Yugoslavia. Did the king manage to make them Yugoslavians and Slovenians? Do you know what happened to them in the sense of their identity? How did they feel?
Thank you for the question. It's hard to tell because at the moment, because I have concentrated on this period between the war and immediate post-war chaotic times. However, many of them received citizenship, of course, and it is also true that this refugee stream didn't stop until 1939. I mean, they were still coming, and they were accepted as civilians from so-called unredeemed regions, as Yugoslavs or Croats and later Yugoslavs, of course.
An additional question to Jernej. I was just wondering what happened actually with their property there in the new Italian state. So
it was mostly it was confiscated, especially after the 1922. Slovene associations, private property of exposed Slovene, so to say, national leaders, was confiscated and nationalized by the state.
Since I don't see any further hands, I'll add a question or two of my own. Since we still have a lot of time separating us from the bus and the Heuriger. Anyway, and my questions fit into the broader question of to what degree the First World War contributed to ethnic categorization and affected how citizenship was conceptualized, and to what degree it was ethnicized, to what degree we already see on the approach towards refugees the first steps into the nation states and their approaches to refugees. We know that refugees were categorized according to their ethnicity in the Habsburg monarchy, that they were very often separated, that a lot of the orders were meant for this or that group, explicitly designing different policies for them and separating them spatially, that the camps were also typically meant for this or that group. So the first question is, and my questions are for all of the speakers. The first one is about the refugee help, relief. To what degree, in what situations it was designed, organized together for all the groups, and in what situations it was separated. Because I believe that this is a time when the way how relief is being provided, it's also state-supported. It tells us something about citizenship, or if you want, some certain form of social citizenship. And the second question is about whether you have any evidence, even if episodic, about the relationship between different groups of refugees, different ethnic groups of refugees, because we typically analyze the relationship between state or local officials and one of these groups, but I very rarely see any evidence, any mention of how, say, Jews and Ruthenians, Jews and Poles, not to speak about Poles and Ruthenians, or Slovenes, were dealing with each other.
Yeah, thank you for both questions, and I know that the first question is a question Michal deals with, and he has a special theory, or not a theory, but that, for instance, in Brno, I mentioned the committee that it's not designed only for Jews, but it is according, as you say, it's close to Vienna, and that's why it depicts the non-ethnic approach. But I also mentioned the committee in Kladno, which is close to Prague, and we have a committee which is called the Relief Committee for Galician and Bukovinian Refugees, and it's not it's not only for Jews, this relief committee. However, if you look at the members, or most of the members are from the Jewish community, and the Jewish community is the most active. This is, I cannot say it at the moment why in some towns or small towns or bigger towns where relief committees were established not to an ethnic key, as for instance in Prague. I cannot say why. In some towns it is non-ethnic, and sometimes in towns it's according to an ethnic key. I think we just have it also obvious that there's still to do a lot of research in this regard also to the refugees in the Bohemian lands. And they also, for instance, in the Committee of Kladno, we can find in the minutes there several times underlined that they are not only designed for Jewish refugees, but I don't have any cases so far dealing with non-Jews. So. To the second question, it depends. At the moment, my research was limited to the sources in the relief committees, which preserved in the archive, in the Jewish community archives, and which are in the archive of the Jewish Museum in Prague. I think it's still my plan to go to the district archives as well, and then I think you can find much more maybe sources. Discussing also the relationships between refugees of different background. Yeah, that's my answer. Very limited answer because of the sources.
Yeah, I also need to go out to some of the district archives as well, and I'm hoping that I will find something that will talk about different groups of refugees and not just single groups, because that's what I seem to find, and I don't know if that's because they were often sent to different places in groups, but who knows. And then in terms of the question about relief and thinking about citizenship, at least in looking at these pleas, some of these refugee appeals for aid, and I've seen then resident complaints to the state, or residents asking the state for reparations for damage done to their property by refugees. I mean, in that sense, they are claiming Austria as, their sort of legitimate state. I didn't say that very well, but they are sort of staking some sort of claim in writing those petitions.
Yes, I also hope that during the summer I'll have an opportunity to go to the archives at a lower level, and I haven't come across yet regarding the question about this relations between different ethnic groups. As in terms of the question of relief associations, they were organized for all of the civilians from the south, regardless of their presupposed national affiliation.
Thank you. I guess we should come together again after the summer with your new research from all the regional archives. If you've got another question.
Yes, but from a very obscure point of view. So as a Hungarian sociologist and social historian, so thank you very much for the extremely deep going case studies, and I learned a lot. I have another experience searching the similar sources, and I would like to ask you whether this moving and staying of Jewish population could be used from the state as a kind of ideological legitimation of new nation building, because, for example, in the Hungarian case, the staying Jewish population could be used as a kind of national proud and national identity group staying in the new Czechoslovakian Republic, while the moving Jewish population was stigmatized in the Hungarian state as foreign citizens or foreign ethnic groups which are dangerous for this very small after Trianon state. So I'd like to ask whether this kind of usage and abusage of refugees and huge migration can be observable in your cases as well.
Yeah, thank you, Eva, for your interesting and also again difficult question. Of course, I think you can find sources in this direction in the media, or like press articles using the picture of the moving Jew or the Jew who is a domestic in for instance, in a Czech national discussion, and also in the Czech Jewish movement, for instance, that they also that the moving Jews are much more perceived as a threat than something else. And just now I had an idea, or because I dealt with also the interwar period. In the 30s, at the beginning of the 30s, there's also, or in one Jewish weekly, there's a discussion about national belonging in course of the new refugees from Jewish refugees or Jewish emigration from Nazi Germany, and there's a big clash between. There was one article by Josef Roth who emphasizes the positive potential of the moving Jews, and then there are a lot of local Jewish reactions which are against. So you can also follow maybe this picture then in the 30s again. But it's just, I didn't really make more deeper research in this discussion.
Well, I've only looked into 1919, and it seems the only part of sort of the Jewish question in the new Czechoslovakia that I've really looked at is, what to do with these refugees who are by and large Jewish, and it seems that it's a case of get them out because they're not a part of this state, because I guess they have been moving around and are not. But thank you for your question. It's a great question.
A Jew community had been expelled from Carniola and Styria in the 16th century, and as a consequence, they didn't present. They were not presented within this Slovene nationalistic narrative. However, in the region of Prekmurje, they remained, of course, after the 1918, and they were, in fact, incorporated into this process of formation of Slovene a nation, and some of them were saw themselves as proud Slovenians.
Do you have a comment? Do we have a time for another comment, Bella?
I have a comment for actually somewhere between you two about ex-Hungarian territories that were incorporated in the kingdom of Serbs, Croats and Slovenes. I was checking Međimurje region, and around half of Jews from Međimurje were expelled or voluntarily left because they were considered being Hungarian, and the similar is with southern Hungary that became part of Serbia. So it's not an issue of refugees. It's the Jews that were living there since the end of the 18th century or the 19th century. So not only refugees. Yes.
Stateless Jewish refugee, and the other part of the family could help to build the new nation states. So I think it's
exactly
an interesting question how the families communicated this topic.
Okay, thank you. Thanks to all the panelists. Thanks for all your excellent questions and comments.